Okay, so hello everybody. As you might have noticed, I'm Nancy Doyle, and I'm a chartered occupational psychologist and the founder and chief research officer at Genius Within, and I'm also the co-director of the Centre for Neurodiversity Research at Work, and I'm a fully paid up member of the ADHD Massive. And my plan today was to talk about neurodiversity awareness. And I think there's a lot of people on this call or on this meeting, webinar thing, whatever we're calling it now, who are already quite aware of neurodiversity. So I'm not going to spend too long going over the basics. I think that can be quite repetitive. So I'm going to do a very short little bit of basics of neurodiversity. And then we're going to start talking about the idea of neurodiversity awareness. So how does being aware of neurodiversity contribute to inclusion for neurodivergent thinkers? How does being aware of neurodiversity affect our community? How can awareness training be part of the solution that we are looking for? And what is that solution and what is that problem? And I actually plan on spending not an awful lot of time doing slidey talky things. And what I really like to do is to actually just have nice chats around questions. So I'm going to stop talking as quickly as possible. And then what I hope is that we're going to have a really interesting debate, chat. You know, let's get the challenging questions out there. Let's really think about what's going on with regard to neurodiversity awareness right now. Okay, so very briefly then, just to summarize, a quick intro to Genius Within and who we are, a very basic awareness overview of what we mean by neurodiversity, and then this quite challenging question: does awareness work? And then if we feel like it, I'm going to play you a little video, and that will all depend on time and attention and generally how everybody's feeling. And then we're going to go straight into Q&A. Okay, so there's your signposting. All right, so Genius Within, as you may or may not know, Genius Within are a community interest company. We're founded in 2011, and I realised that not a lot of people know what that means. So a community interest company means that we are legally obliged to return 65% of our distributable profits to the community that we serve. And so a community interest company sits halfway between a charity and a private company. We are limited by shares, so we have shareholders, and we have an employee shareholder scheme. So we are co-owned by our company, by ourselves. But when we get to the point where we are distributing dividends to those shareholders, 65% of them we are legally required to distribute those in pro bono services and activities that would support neurodivergent thinkers in our community. That's what being a community interest company means. And we are also required to report to the Community Interest Company Commission what activities we have funded with our pro bono work, and they have to kind of sign those off every year. So it's quite a high level of diligence, but without the enormous amount of bureaucracy that goes with being a charity, which as an ADHD founder, I just quite couldn't manage, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So we have a team of highly qualified people delivering work across the world. And when I say qualified, but they're qualified by experience and by profession. So professionally, we tend to have a blend of different types of psychologists. So some of us are clinical psychologists. I'm an occupational psychologist. Some of us are health psychologists. And we also have professionally trained coaches. But we have a 75% neurodivergent leadership team and board, and 60% of our staff and associates are disabled. So and one of the reasons that I mention this is because I think it's really important to notice that what we are trying to do in the world at Genius Within is not just deliver services and awareness training and advocacy, but we're also trying to role model what it is like to be a neuro-inclusive company. And how do you do that? So what's it like on the inside? So we're kind of, we're working around the edges in this community field, trying to get kind of, we know that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population has a minority neurotype, and we know that minority neurotypes are less likely to be employed, more likely to be incarcerated. But we're trying to get people in small numbers. But what does it look like when you have a whole organization where there is where we have some kind of token neurotypicals on the board and some neurotypicals within our staff team, but we're actually very well blended in terms of who's represented in our company. And it's a work in progress, and that's something I'm really, really happy to take questions on at the end, because it's actually the thing I'm most interested in right now. And as we get bigger, it was very easy when we were a small company, but the bigger we get and the more we have to rely on structure and processes and bureaucracy to communicate rather than relationships and everyday conversations, the harder it gets to create neuro-inclusive processes that keep us psychologically safe at work and working at our best. And the easier it is to rely on those sort of standard HR protocols that we know are what are keeping our neurodivergent colleagues out of work. So how do we internally do that? Really happy to take questions on that later. Okie dokie, so some basics then. I really like this slide. I've been using this slide in a number of talks, so apologies if you've seen it before, people. But I think it's really useful to go through the history of how we got to where we got to. And, so the idea of neurodiversity in its broadest sense is that human beings have diverse ways of thinking. Our neurological profiles are diverse. Some of us are good at everything. Some of us struggle with lots of things. Some of us are really good at some things and not good at other things. And then how are we measuring that? So the people that struggle at everything, what do we call everything? Are we only talking about cognitive ability? Are we only talking about things that could translate into jobs and economic performance? Or are we also talking about social and emotional skills and the experience of being human and perceiving and appreciating things like music or dance? So where are we defining ability is a big question in the neurodiversity movement. But the basic premise is that we're diverse, and in every human population, some of us are really good at detail processing and others of us really aren't. Some of us are particularly skilled at verbal communication, and some of us do much better with visual form or spatial form. So if you take this idea in its kind of purest sense, without any of the layers that we've added to it yet that I'll talk through that are on this slide, then it's just the idea that human communities work best when we have a blend of specialists and generalists. And it's really as simple as that. However, in the 18th century and the beginning of the 18th to 19th century, we started standardizing the human experience. And as the Industrial Revolution took hold and the need for humans to live less in kind of farming communities or small tribes or small market trading towns kind of changed into larger cities and industrial manufacturing, it became more important for human beings to be standardized in the way that they thought and worked. And we brought in things like mainstream education. And around the same time, and I do not think this is a coincidence, around the same time, people whose brains were not easily standardized started to get called things, and we started to create names and words for people who had particular styles of behaving or thinking that didn't fit into that kind of normative model of what we needed humans to do for the industrial capabilities that we were developing. So the first point on my slide, it says the 18th century to early 20th century, we started to use words like word blindness, autism, hysteria, hyperkinetic syndrome, clumsy child syndrome, and we were describing these differences medically. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, somebody who had clumsy child syndrome, for example, wouldn't necessarily have been taught that. It would have just been obvious to them and their family that they weren't going to be, I'm trying to think of something they couldn't be, actually. Something that would require a lot of gross motor control. So they weren't going to be necessarily a horse person. What are those people that ride on horses and have big poles? They probably wouldn't have been those people.
Jouster.
Jouster. Thank you, Jackie. They might not have been a jouster, but they might well have been a town crier. They might well have been a market trader. They might have been particularly good at music. So there's lots of things they would have done, and they would have just been shepherded into that sort of role and that sort of career. And people learned because they had apprenticeships, and you know, that was the way things were done. So we started creating these names for people that couldn't sit still and handwrite, and process numbers and literacy in the way that we wanted everyone to do. And then towards the mid to late 20th century, we started to get a bit more precise. We started to get precision terminology for these differences. Instead of hyperkinetic syndrome, we started describing people as having attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Oh, please, will someone come up with an alternative name for that? I'm so bored of it. We started to talk about autistic spectrum condition and dyslexia, dyspraxia. So the attention all being on the things that people can't do in a lot of those labels. So difficulty with words, difficulty with movement, disorder this, disorder that. And in science, what we were doing was looking for functional locations of difficulty. So we were scanning the brains of children to find the bits that were broken, essentially. And one of my first pieces of research in my PhD was a look at the number of papers published on dyslexia in the English language. And there were 11,000 papers published between 1995 and when I started my PhD, which was I can't remember, 2013. And of those 11,000 papers, I did a sample check of a few hundred and found that 62% of them were in neuroscience journals. As well, 95% of the research was on children. So when you took child samples out of those 11,000 papers, there were less than 1,000 left. And then when you added work to the search terms, we only had 41. So we were very much focused in our understanding of these differences around medical impairments, and that was the model they were using. And then we came into the 21st century, and just as we approached the 21st century, Judy Singer published her book, Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea. And we started to embrace this idea of neurodiversity as an essential diversity within the human species, similarly to the way biodiversity is essential to the ecology of our world. And since then, the language has evolved even more, and we talk about neurodivergent people, and those will be people with a minority neurotype. We might talk about neurominorities as a cluster of those neurotypes, such as ADHD, autistic spectrum condition. You know, if you bunch them all together, they are neurominorities. And Judy started using that word really to develop the political activism of minority rights advocates. So similarly to the way the deaf community had advocated for their right to exist as deaf people, Judy's idea was that minority neurotypes could come together and advocate for their right to exist as minority neurotypes. And so that's what was happening in this kind of sociological, social model of disability field. From the more medical model, some quite useful things were also coming out in understanding the biological differences. And so rather than looking for deficits necessarily, going, well, what's different? What do neurodivergent people have that is different in their neurological profile? And we've found some differences in neurotransmitters, such as dopamine, noradrenaline, and also GABA. Those are neurotransmitters that affect our perception of risk. They affect how curious we are, and they affect how anxious we are. And so sometimes neurodivergent people can choose to medicate for those particular difficulties if they're in a context that they can't manipulate to suit their purpose. And that's another thing that I'm really, really happy to take questions on at the end, because I think it's a particularly interesting area for debating at the moment. But some of the really contemporary work in neuroscience has discovered that this isn't about functional locations of difficulty. There isn't a bit of the brain that's broken that we're going to dramatically find and then magically be able to fix people. But they're not necessarily wrong. The differences aren't necessarily wrong. They're just different. So with that lens, we've discovered that neurodivergent brains tend to be more likely to be hyperconnected connected. So the communication between different parts of the brain is different. And that can lead to hyper and hyposensitivity. So some neurodivergent thinkers are particularly good at hearing or smelling or tasting or feeling or seeing, and can do that at an intensely more focused detail than neurotypical peers. And from an evolutionary standpoint, that's actually an incredibly useful thing to have in a tribe of humans. If everybody was like that, there would be quite a lot of overwhelm, but having a few people with that particular talent is really quite necessary for our survival. And so with that lens, some of the neuro scientific research is really helping us to define the evolutionary purpose and the benefit of a neurodiverse species. And I'm all for that. Okay, where are we going next? She says, trying to click the button. Okay, so just to rehearse the absolute basics of neurodiversity, we tend to include dyscalculics, dyslexics, ADHDers, Tourette's, dyspraxics, autistics. We can also choose to include those with mental health needs and those who acquire neurodiversity. And we can also choose to include learning disabilities, which we don't. And we must update this Venn diagram, Jackie, to include learning disabilities. And something I've done on this slide, which I'm not going to talk through one thing at a time, but if you want to have a read aloud version of this slide, please just put your email address or send your email address to Jackie, and we'll get you out the detail behind this. It's based on some research, but the idea of all of these conditions being clustered together is that there are this pattern of strengths and weaknesses. You know, some things are working really well and some things are not. And it's based, you know, everyone in this pot has what's called a spiky profile, and everyone in this pot is a naturally, you know, this occurs naturally in our human condition. There's enough humans that experience anxiety, depression. There's enough humans that are dyslexic. There's enough humans who develop things like multiple sclerosis, or, you know, brain trauma is enough a part of our everyday life that we have to say that our responses to it and our neurological profiles that emerge from these differences are a naturally occurring thing. They are they're kind of normal. And so let's just look at the spiky profile. This kind of just sums up what I've been saying, is that different people measure differently on cognitive abilities, and we could replace cognitive abilities with another form of assessment there if we wanted to. Some people are specialists and some people are generalists, and that's really the basics of neurodiversity awareness. I think it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that, but I can go into that in more detail for those that want to at the end. So despite that very lovely frame of evolutionary purpose and neurodiversity being as essential as biodiversity, neurodivergent people are more likely to be out of work, more likely to be in precarious employment, and less likely to be promoted. We are more likely to be underqualified. We are more likely to be misunderstood, and that can have, and more likely to be fearful of misunderstandings, and that can have huge ramifications in the criminal justice system, interacting with authorities, interacting with the state, and how the state treats us when we are misunderstood and when we are fearful of misunderstandings. Lots of people have something that I call pre-employment trauma disorder, which is that you come into a workplace expecting to be misunderstood, and so therefore those defenses can actually create a sense of embattlement that other people can react to, and that can then cause a conflict where a conflict doesn't need to occur. We are more likely to have communication difficulties, and we are more likely to have sensory sensitivities that can lead to overwhelm and shutdown. So even though we have this kind of huge carrot of the neurodiversity movement, we've also got this very real kind of scenario, and those numbers haven't changed dramatically in the last 30 years. So the disability employment gap is the same as it was 30 years ago. It isn't really moving. It's shifting a little bit. And so then we come to, intersectional issues, and neurodiversity has been historically a quite white middle class space. We know that there are huge disparities in the number of men diagnosed compared to the number of women. And this was kind of taken at face value for a long time, and people started theorizing as to why there might be more men diagnosed than women, but without actually putting that through some feminist deconstruction to say, well, actually, is that actually the case? And perhaps the way that we're describing these conditions is based on a male norm or not a female norm. And I've got a Forbes blog in prep actually that I'm working on with Professor Amanda Kirby, the missing women in neurodiversity. So something that you might not know is that Dr. Sukhareva in Russia discovered autism 20 years before Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger were writing about it. And she actually published case reports describing perfectly the criteria that was then used to diagnose the first cases of autism in the USA. So we have got, some real historical issues around gender, but also around race and ethnicity. So our understanding of neurodiversity tends to be based on the Anglosphere and more specifically the North American and English Anglosphere. So we've got to look at why that is and how that's happening. Some recent research published last year indicated that Black children are now being diagnosed autistic at the same rates as white children in British schools, but they're not getting educational healthcare support at the same levels. And Black girls in particular, and Roma girls in particular, are still not being diagnosed at the highest levels, so at the same levels. So we've got these kind of, and one interesting stat from that paper actually that I really thought was quite stunning was that the ratio of male to female diagnoses in Burnley was 12-1, but the ratio of male to female diagnoses in Gloucestershire was only 2-1. So if this is a truly genetic difference that affects the Y chromosome and not the XX chromosome, then are people in Burnley really that genetically different from people in Gloucester? What is going on here? This feels to me like a social construction and not a truly physiological difference that's caused by genetics. We've also got the intersection there of socioeconomic class, and we're also finding more and more that neurodivergence is prevalent at a higher rate in trans and non-binary communities and LGBTQIA2S communities. I'm just in the middle of some research that has looked at sensory sensitivity, and we found that women report higher levels of sensory sensitivity than men, but non-binary people report higher levels of sensory sensitivity than both men and women, and it's even higher. So there's something there that we don't understand yet, but we know that there are intersectional layers of adverse impact in this community, and that's something also to be aware of. And I think the more we focus on neurodiversity awareness, the more we have to bring in the other ways in those overlapping veins of how people's experience varies. So does awareness work? Now, this is a question that I've been asking myself through reviewing literature, and I've reviewed. We did a literature review. We extracted 111 papers. We whittled it down through the usual ways of quality control and relevance control to about 25. And we looked at papers from race, gender, age, disability, and LGBTQIA+ research to ascertain whether awareness training works in other forms of other forms of inclusion. Because while contextual neurodiversity research is very, very novel and new, and there's not a lot of it, those inclusion movements are more mature in our workplaces, and we have data to help us understand whether or not the things we do are likely to work. And what we found looking at awareness training, so when we provide this sort of training, we tell people about neurodiversity, what it means, what the conditions are, what's going on in people's brains or not, what might happen in the workplace. When we do that, does it make a difference? You know, is it going to result in lower levels of miscommunication? Is it going to result in increased representation in the workplace, lower levels of incarceration, lower levels of mental distress? So one of the things, these are some absolute headlines findings, and they're not published yet. They will be later this year. So I've put the original sources on the page because I haven't published the summary sources yet. But looking specifically at awareness training, the things that make awareness training work is if there is some knowledge transfer to reduce the sense of otherness. But there also needs to be contact time to reduce the other sense of otherness. So if you go on a neurodiversity awareness course with a bunch of neurotypicals and there are no neurodivergent voices in the room and there's nobody there to, can make to kind of anchor what's being said, it's not necessarily going to reduce otherness. The other thing that's really important for awareness training in other fields, and so therefore likely we could predict it will be the same here, is that there is leadership and HR in attendance in the training. So if everybody's made to go on a training, but none of the leaders turn up and no one from HR is there, it's not going to result in behavior change. It might result in cognitive changes and emotional changes. So the people that go on the training might feel different about neurodivergent people, but it's not going to change their behavior. Mandatory training is a bit contentious, so are people forced to go on training, and what happens in our workplaces when we're forced to go on training? Is that an okay thing? Is that not okay thing? So there are it's a problematic concept, which I'm really happy to unpack in Q&A. But one of the things I've learned from doing this review is that mandatory training is also more likely to create behavior change because it signifies that this is a company priority. And so that's worth thinking about as well when you're engaging in and delivering awareness training. The other thing that works really well in training is that you create a positive identity for majorities. So this came out of racial justice work, looking at the effect of awareness training and identifying that if there's a kind of blanket, white is bad, black or brown is good, then that doesn't result in behavior change. And so one of the things that does work is training people how to take an anti-racist stance, and how that anti-racist stance can be leveraged into positive action and a sense of allyship that kind of engages the pro-social and motivated elements of the people engaging in the training. And I think that's an interesting one for us in the neurodiversity movement. How do we have neurotypical allies? What does it mean to be a neurotypical ally? What does a neurotypical ally look like? What could they do? And how do we ensure that we're not reinforcing the in-group, out-group by having that kind of broad brush, neurodivergence is great, neurotypical is not great. Oppressor versus victim. And that was one of the other things that came out of that understanding of positive identity for majorities from the racial justice training, was that creating a victim mentality for the othered group also does not change behavior. So when we present awareness as when we present people as victims, we are less likely to engage inclusion activities. And I think there's so much in there. We could probably spend the entire rest of this hour talking just about that. But I just want you to be aware that these things are out there. If you're working in advocacy or campaigning, or if you're a change agent in your business or looking to be an ally, remember that we're not reinventing the wheel here. There are other inclusion movements that have gone before us, and they have useful lessons that we can learn from. So one of the things that we need to look at is, what does that practical action look like? When we are taking action to do inclusion, I tend to think of awareness training really as being on the first step. We've got peer groups, we do talks, we have champions. Do we have a discernible impact from that? Do we get more people into employment? Do we have a more representative workforce? Do we have a less overrepresented prison population from peer groups, champions, and talks? And the answer from the research that I've been doing is basically no. If we want to affect change at that systemic level, then we need a better plan, and it needs needs to have practical steps on it. It's the thing that opens the door to talking about those plans. So it's definitely a useful step. Awareness training isn't pointless, but it is pointless if we don't do anything else. So if we just do awareness training and we think we've ticked the box and then we don't need to do anything else in our businesses, then we won't be affecting change. We'll be creating worry, we'll be creating anxiety that our company might be doing something wrong, but we won't actually be bringing people in. And then with neurodiversity, we really need to understand what part of the neurominority group is aligned with disability. And this is another little thread that I'm happy to be asked questions on. What's the difference or the similarities between being neurodivergent and being disabled? I feel like there's some potential ableism embedded within the neurodiversity movement that says, well, we're not disabled because there's nothing wrong with us. And it's like, well, what do you mean there's nothing wrong with us? Because there's a little story in there which I feel like we could unpick if you want to. But one way we do really align with the disability movement, and we need to embrace disability at work, is the idea of reasonable adjustments and accommodations. Creating value, creating flexibility in the way that we work, adjusting our work processes, our work environments, and the work requirements for individuals creates value and progression for individuals. And we have got good research evidence for the neurodivergent community that when we make reasonable adjustments, we do improve performance. And a lot of companies are kind of at that stage and doing that. But if we want to change the systems, we have to work at the system level. And so our final step on the slide, when we get to the top, we'll be looking at universal design concepts, universal design to prevent difficulty and enable all. And when we get to that stage, we're looking at company performance impact, and very few companies are here. And one of the things that I've found from reviewing the wider equality diversity literature is that consistently in other areas of equality diversity at work, when you start to increase the diversity in a business, initially there's more conflict. But medium to long term, there's a higher level of performance and a higher level of creativity and a higher level of productivity. So there's a little pain barrier that goes with human beings learning to communicate across different barriers in different ways. But when you get there and everybody's included, you have a more dynamic workforce. And it's tentative evidence. There's not buckets of it, but there's not contrary evidence. So there's, on the balance of evidence, looking at what people have actually been able to research and find, we've got some hope there and something to aim for in terms of what we're doing. And I think that's quite exciting.